I want to just give that good definition of what depression is, kind of that textbook uh, definition, if you will. So, depression is a list of symptoms. Okay. When we diagnose depression, we diagnose it by the things that we are seeing and the things that people are reporting and what they're experiencing. As I had a conversation the other day with an individual who was asking me, Jeff, are they able to diagnose things like depression or schizophrenia or other mental health things, in a physical way? Are they able to do like brain scans? Are they able to draw blood? And the answer to that is no. The only way that, again, we diagnose most mental health issues is through just, again, a set of symptoms. So some of those symptoms are sleep and appetite. And here's the important thing with this. It can go either way. A person can have decreased or increased, just a change in their sleep and appetite, and that's definitely a sign of depression. I was meeting with an individual the other day, and they had lost quite a bit of weight because of their depression. And it was interesting. She did mention the fact that while, yeah, it was nice to lose weight, she said it's really kind of scary because when you get that loss of appetite, it's almost like this feeling of not thriving or surviving anymore. And in some ways, it's kind of scary. So there can be that great loss of appetite and desire to eat. And sometimes this is called like that failure to thrive. So an individual kind of loses that desire to really, move forward in a strong way. Another common symptom is focus. It can be difficult for an individual to focus, whether it be in relationships, whether it be at their job, or anything, or an interest, anything that they're doing or want to do. They have a hard time, sustaining that attention. Anger is a big one, and I say a big one too. This is really a big one when it comes to males. Now it can happen with females as well, but we as males tend to want to express all of our feelings kind of all bottled up into one massive emotion, and that massive emotion is usually anger. So then we want to pull this up here real quick, another picture they often use. So if you are familiar with this, the anger iceberg, right? Anger being a very strong, something that we often see and is very visible, but we have to recognize what's underneath that anger, right? All the different emotions. And so when these emotions build up, as I say, it's that build up to a blow up, and we see the anger, but really there's something else that's going on underneath. So as men, we're really good at holding everything in until we kind of reach that breaking point and then blow up. You'll see this again with your children, all right? Now here's the thing too, as I'm discussing some of these symptoms of depression, with your children, they're not going to be able to express, they're not going to come to you and say, hey, I'm feeling this, especially when they're little, but we'll notice it in their behaviors. And as you can imagine, your focus and anger, your sleep, and even appetite are some big ways we can see this in children. All right, so paranoia. This is one that's a little less known or recognized, but individuals who are dealing with depression often, are worried about whether people are thinking about them, but they also just are kind of in this heightened state of fear. Okay, and they're worried. They're worried that they're going to lose their job. They're worried about how people are perceiving them. They're worried about their friendships. They're worried about a lot of different things. They're worried about even just bigger things, like more worried about, say, natural disasters and things like this. And although the worry may, be rooted in something that's real, they're just really, really paranoid about it, and they can't get it off their mind. Okay. Loss of interest. This is right. I mean, the things that people typically enjoy, right? When they're depressed, they're not enjoying, and so this is a big marker as well. Memory, ability to recall. I have lots of people talk about having depression brain, where they feel dumb when they're dealing with depression. And then not being present. So not being able to be in the moment, right? And if you look at any type of mental illness or disorder, it kind of boils down to this. You're either stuck in the past or lamenting and worrying about the future. You're not enjoying being present, being available in that moment to enjoy what you could be enjoying. Okay, so real quick, I want to go over some sobering statistics, right, about depression. 1 out of 3 people will suffer from depression. 80% will not be diagnosed or seek help. In 2016, there were 45,000 suicides in the U.S. It's the 10th leading cause of death. And ages 15 to 34, second leading cause of death. And we actually saw an increase in the state of Utah from 2014 to 16 by 20%. So it is unfortunately on the rise, and we're seeing a lot of implications and problems because of it. Okay. So I want to talk a bit about depression and anxiety. And I want to just talk about the relationship they have with each other. You need to recognize that they are under what we call the umbrella of a mood disorder. So it's kind of like you start with a mood disorder, then you move down to depression and anxiety, all right? And then, of course, from there, it kind of branches out into your different types of depression and types of anxiety. But you pretty much can't have one without the other. And I love to use the analogy of, two, wrestlers, right? And you got these tag team wrestlers, and one's on the ropes, right? Just waiting to pounce and get you. So let's say depression's on you, and depression's working you over. If you think about it, if you're depressed, you're not doing the things that you should be doing or want to do, you're going to start getting anxious, right? You're going to start, feeling like you're missing out on things. You're not getting stuff done, and then anxiety is going to kick in. So again, kind of picture anxiety jumping off that rope, and it starts attacking you. So, and again, you're anxious, you're feeling this high level of distress, this physical reaction, and your body can only take so much of that. And so it's like, okay, enough of that. And so depression comes in and does just that. It depresses, it pushes you down. So kind of think about the interchange and the back and forth play that way between depression and anxiety. Now, you definitely can experience one more than the other. And you definitely can go days, weeks, months, of just dealing with one and not the other. But they can also play dirty, and they can both attack you, okay? Jump off the ring and whomp you. So just know that's how they play. You don't have one without the other. The beautiful thing is the treatment for anxiety and depression is the same for the most part. There may be a few things that are different with different types of anxiety, but for the most part, the things that you learn to deal with one apply to the other. Okay. So kind of going back to that textbook description of anxiety or depression, I want you to know what the different types of depression are. And a little bit about what it takes to meet those categories, if you will. So the first one I want to talk about is major depression. Major depression is, when you're feeling constant depression, and again, we talked about those symptoms, and you're feeling this for, 6 months or more. All right. It's not resolving itself. No matter what you do, it's still there. You're still experiencing it. So again, think back of those symptoms we talked about, and you're experiencing it for 6 months. And it's affecting these areas. If you're a student, so if it's, a child, if it's affecting their schoolwork and their attendance, okay, then that's, indicator. If you're an adult and it's affecting your job and your ability to work, there's one mark there towards depression. If it's affecting your relationships, and if it's affecting your interests. So if it's affecting any one of those things where you're incapable of doing those things on a consistent basis for 6 months, then you meet that clinical criteria for depression, for major depression. So situational depression is just as it sounds. This is when a person experiences something that brings on depression. So often if you think about loss, if you think about, what the loss of a loved one, a loss of a job, a loss of one's health, that brings on a situational depression. Now, as that situation resolves itself, or as you resolve that situation with yourself, then it goes away. So it's very much where you have that kind of prime indicator that, okay, this is why I'm dealing with depression. Major depression doesn't have to be that way, right? And that's what's so tricky about it, is we think, well, there has to be something wrong. And when you talk to people and explain to them that you're dealing with this, that's one of the first things they ask. Well, what happened? What's the matter? What's making you depressed? And that's the hardest thing about major depression, is it doesn't have to be like any one particular thing, right? It doesn't have to be, again, like a situational depression where you can put your finger on it. Very, very, right? Very difficult, because people just who have never dealt with depression don't really understand. And that goes to that question. I know many of you are probably asking this, right? Are we born with this? The nature versus nurture. Do we learn this? And it's both. Okay, it can be a combination of both, or it could be one or the other. I think in some ways it doesn't matter because the help's the same. But I think it's important to recognize that, you could have been taught it from parents who dealt with depression, or you could have experienced things that brought it on that you don't remember. Either way, you're dealing with it. Okay, so about bipolar depression. Bipolar used to be called manic depression. And what that is, it's a person who experiences the mania, right, the high part of depression, where they feel very euphoric, they have lots of energy, often do risky behaviors, they often do things that, just out of character. But they struggle with sleeping because they have so much energy they can't sleep. And individuals say, like, if you have an individual who's a drinker, they'll often go on binge drinking. If you have a person who's into like shopping, they'll max out the credit cards. And then they go to the other end, right, which is the depression and the drop. And so they're in bed all the time, right? All those classic symptoms we talked about with depression, they're experiencing that. So they have the high highs and the low lows. This one is more, this is important to recognize, that this is one that is more on the medical model of things. In other words, a person needs to be under the constant care of a physician who can prescribe medication. Medication is a must with a person dealing with bipolar depression. And that's okay. And in some ways, too, while some people may be like, man, that's depressing. I don't have to be on medication the rest of my life. In some ways, it's kind of good, because then it's like, well, you know what? If you take your medication, this is going to be a big help. And knowing that it is medical and it's something you didn't do anything wrong, right? And I don't know, it's important to, I think, to recognize that. Okay, so that's bipolar. Now, dysthymia. Dysthymia is something that many people don't know about. And this is more of like that middle, moderate grade depression. So if a major depression was like a scale of 1 to 10, like a 10, dysthymia is, I don't know, it could be like a 4, a 5, a 6. And a person deals with this for a long time, months and months, years and years, decades and decades even. Now, the tough thing, and this is actually the hardest depression to get over, because it becomes very much a part of who the person is. They take it on as their personality, who they are. I like to describe it as kind of like this functioning depressant, right? They go to work, they get their things done, but they lack just a lot of energy and zest for life, and they can fluctuate too, right, on that level of depression, but for the most part, just flat. And they just kind of learn to deal with it. And people who are around them or love them just kind of learn to deal with it. And that's just who they are. All right. And because there isn't that major noticeable chasm and difference between this huge depression and feeling a lot better just months before, again, it becomes who they are, and it becomes really hard to work through. So those are the different types of depression. Again, if you guys have any questions, feel free to type away. If not, I'll just keep moving on here. Now, I want to also describe the characteristics of individuals with depression. And as I've mentioned before too, Anxiety and depression, very, very similar. Okay. And so I find that individuals that are dealing with both these have these same qualities and characteristics. Okay. Um, oh, got a good question here from Chantel. Does major depression often start with dysthymia? That's an excellent question. I would say the opposite. That dysthymia often starts with major depression, and it isn't. It is again people with major depression who get help. Again, they can usually work through it a lot quicker because they remember what it was like before. They don't want to be feeling the way they feel because they remember having more energy and having more life and more zest for things. Whereas again, dysthymia, it's just kind of half that intensity, if you will, and so not as motivated to work through. So excellent question, but I would say it's almost the opposite, right? Okay. So thank you. So going on to back to the characteristics of depression. Individuals are often very kind and nice. Okay. They tend to want to not always like stick up for themselves. They'll often sacrifice themselves for others. And I put the distinction between kind and nice because I think it's good to be kind. I think being kind is when we are considerate, understanding, helpful to others, but not at the expense of ourselves. And I've kind of coined the idea of being nice as one who will let others step on them. They'll do all these things for others, but they'll sacrifice what they need for others. And simply put, right, we've got to be there and fill our cup, if you will, before we can help others. So, common characteristic. Empathic, all right? They feel the emotions of others very strongly. They feel like the weight of the world. They read people's emotions. And that kind of goes to that emotional piece as well. So one thing too I like to emphasize, when we think of, especially with children, and teenagers, when we think of someone who's depressed, we'll often look at that stereotypical kind of emo kid, right? The gothic kid, the dark clothes, the black hair, the black fingernails, right? Listening to Marilyn Manson or, what have you. Very mopey and down and flat. And we want to say, yeah, they're just dark, right? So dark and don't really feel a lot of emotions. The reality is, the reason that individual's that way is because they feel things so deeply, okay? Because they feel emotion so strongly, because they are so emotional, because they are so empathetic. They are empaths. So they want to shut it down because it becomes overwhelming, right? So it's almost like bring on the darkness so I can flatten out all these emotions I'm feeling. Now, many of you, I've probably talked to, or maybe themselves have been on medications for depression. And one of the things that I hear often in my office is that, antidepressants, Jeff, they make me feel flat. And in some ways, that's maybe the purpose. People want to talk about medications being happy pills. Well, in reality, individuals who do feel a lot of emotions, again, and these are often individuals with depression, anxiety, don't want to feel it so much, and that's part of the process and the function of an antidepressant. And so, and again, this isn't to say that medications are good or bad. It's just an interesting function that can happen with a lot of individuals, and absolutely a good thing if needed. So I want to put that out there. Perfectionist, very perfectionistic. They want to they believe they can control everything by controlling the world around them. Okay. And then of course they feel like this failure when things aren't, 100% in the way they want it, which can bring on and increase that depression. Are often pleasers, that controlling, kind of with that perfectionist. Again, very insightful, very, very self-aware of things, constantly picking up on, cues, risk, right? Feelings, again, that empath and emotional, and that weighs down on them. And then physically aware. People with depression are very aware of their bodies. Now, they're very in tune, right, with their bodies. which again could be a good thing, but also can be a real struggle because when they feel a little bit sick or feel a little something or another, their minds, paranoia we talked about earlier, can really take control, and they really start worrying that, oh my gosh, if I got something, am I going to die, right? Okay, so there you go. Characteristics of individuals with depression. So I brought this up a little bit before, are we taught depression or are we born with it? And as I mentioned before, yes, okay? It can be both. It can be one or the other. This is that great debate, right? The nature versus nurture. I don't think it's so important, again, to recognize and understand, right? Because if you were, say, born under parents who dealt with depression, right? Did you get that because there's a genetic, right, medical component, or is it because they had it, they taught it to you? What I do want to emphasize in this, though, is if you, as a parent, or if your parents dealt with anxiety or depression, you absolutely have a greater chance of having it yourself. If your parents, or you as a parent, you and your spouse both deal with depression, okay, it's pretty much guaranteed your children will too. Now that doesn't mean that they're going to be doomed and their life's over, but just know that, hey, the more you know about it, the more you can help it with them, the less it'll affect them in a negative way. And again, I want to go back to those characteristics and traits that people with depression have. All right, let's just pull those up real quick again. These are not bad things, okay? These are amazing qualities and characteristics. I like to frame this again as being a superpower, all right? Some super amazing abilities. You just got to learn to use it in a way that doesn't destroy you. Kind of going back to that kind or nice, right? Learning ways to take care of yourself and advocate for yourself. So, hope that answers that question there, because again, I get that all the time, right? Are we, nature versus nurture? All right. So, as I mentioned, part of this this presentation is going to be about suicide too. And suicide, as I mentioned in some of those early statistics, is a really big thing. It's become more prevalent. It's just growing in numbers, and so I think it's very important that we're aware and understand it. With this increase, there's been several things that have been to blame. Now, I think we all know when we just stop and look at ourselves and look at society, and in some ways look at the way the world's going. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why suicide's on the rise. But here's statistically some of the reasons and some of the blame. So in the recession 10 years ago, we saw an increase then. They wondered if it was, again, related to that. The opioid epidemic has definitely increased suicidality, divorce rates, bullying, right? And of course, we look at some of the cyberbullying, the availability to bully and bully more in an easier way, okay, is definitely on the rise. There's been a big study too on elevations. So if you live in a higher elevation, they found that suicidality is higher in states like Utah, Colorado, okay, where we live in a higher elevation. And they have some medical reasoning and belief behind that. Of course, mental health, and then social media screen time. So, that isolating, right? Kind of separating ourselves from others. So these are some of the things. I think it's just, if you look at those and think, okay, these could be some indicators for, again, myself or my loved ones. I think it's, it's good to know those. So what are the signs of suicide? All right, what are the mood signs of suicide? So again, depression, anxiety, loss of interest, irritability. Okay, we talked about those things before. Humiliation and shame. When individuals have attempted or committed suicide, that can be an indicator. Okay, so we go back to the bullying, we go back to some of this. Humiliation and shame has been in there. Agitation and anger, another strong emotion. As I mentioned before, again, it's the tip of the iceberg, so there's lots of other feelings in there. So understanding when we're dealing with anger and agitation, it's because we're not expressing and showing a lot of emotion. So we have to look at this and say, those who don't do a good job letting it out, sharing the whole gamut of feelings, are at higher risk of suicide. And then this is important to talk about too. Relief and sudden improvement. What we've found is that individuals who actually go through and attempt suicide are actually in a better place than they were when they were suicidal but didn't attempt. So what that boils down to is a person has been down and out for a long time and suicidal and depressed. And then when they feel a little bit better and they're doing a little bit better, they think to themselves, I don't want to go back to where I was before. And it scares them thinking about going back to that really deep, dark place. And so this is where we see more attempts happen, is when they're actually in a little bit better of a spot. Okay. So symptoms of suicide, again, depression, anxiety, ADHD, substance abuse. These are the diagnoses that if someone was diagnosed and were suicidal, these are comorbid with suicide. All right. So what do we want to watch for, right? Whether it be some of the things that we're thinking and feeling and saying to ourselves, or again, what our children are saying. So this one's really important. Individuals, right, who are suicidal, of course, will talk about killing themselves. I mean, I get that. That's kind of an obvious one. But there will be some of that talk, and we need to take that serious, okay? Feelings of hopelessness, all right? So when a person stops talking about the future, stops talking about plans, things they're excited to be doing, we need to watch for this. And again, look for these nuances and particles in their conversation. Having no reason to live, again, expressions of, why am I here? What's the point? Being a burden to others. It's a very common one that individuals, again, when we look back, again, what a person experiences with depression, that kind versus nice, they don't feel any worth unless there's something to other people. And so when they're feeling like they're a burden on others, that's really hard on them. They don't feel any worth. So again, watch for that talk about being a burden on others. Feeling trapped, feel like there's no way out. People who are suicidal, they don't want to die. They don't want to be done. Well, they want to be done with what they're feeling. They don't want to hurt themselves. They don't want to hurt others. They just feel like it's maybe the only avenue and only option to feeling better. Okay. And then unbearable pain. Emotionally, and I think it's important to recognize physically, right? So individuals who have dealt with like chronic pain and things like that, they're at high risk of suicide. Okay. So again, any questions on any of these kind of talking points or things that people verbalize that we need to watch for as signs of suicidality? Okay. All right. Move on. So again, in children, right? Teenagers and younger, and then again, in a lot of us, we aren't going to talk always. We're not always going to share and express what's going on. So we really have to look at the behaviors, all right? Okay, so increase alcohol or drug use. Again, like alcohol, alcohol is a depressant. That's the category of substance it's in. So if a person's depressed and they're using a depressant, they're going to be more depressed, right? And increase their possibility of suicide. 2, looking for a way to end their lives, such as online searching and other methods. Look for some of those behaviors. Check your kids' computers if you're worried, right? Check their cell phones. Look, do a search on their history. If you don't see a history, right, that's another indicator, right, that something's up because they're wanting to hide that. Withdrawing from activities, isolating from family and friends, sleeping too much and too little. Again, a lot of these are the same symptoms of depression. That saying goodbye, okay? Some of those subtle things of even just saying, hey, you know what, if something ever happened to me, I want you to have, this or that, okay? That's another behavior indicator. So yeah, giving away prized possessions and the aggression, and then that constant chronic fatigue. All right. Now, just some other factors, some other kind of little known things to watch for. You know, when I ask people and I ask the question, hey, when do you think suicidality or suicide happens the most, or depression? And what season of the year? And almost all the time people will say, oh, the winter, which makes sense, right? I mean, it's, you know, it's dark earlier, it's cold. Some of the things we enjoy doing that we do in the summer, we can't do. But actually, it is summertime when people get most depressed and we have more suicides. And the reason is because that person who is depressed is kind of watching everybody else enjoying life and having a good time. So they feel more alone, more isolated, more distant. In some ways, we all kind of feel the same when we're huddled in our, in our homes and just kind of vegging out to TV and Netflix, right? But the summertime, it really feels like, oh man, I'm missing out and everybody else is enjoying life. Okay, a low to a high, as I mentioned before, when you see someone who's in that really, really low place, been depressed and suicidal, then they have this burst of energy, that is a strong indicator, be aware of that. A copycat, police, teachers, school psychologists are very aware of this, that when one person commits suicide in the school or in a neighborhood, very common for there to be one to two more after that. And why? I mean, there's lots of different reasons. One is, especially with teenagers, right? They see it happen. They see all the attention that this passed away person now gets, and they want that too. Can also kind of give them, I guess, the courage to do it. And there's also suicide pacts where kids have decided we're going to do this together, right? So again, that's a huge, huge factor. Family history, right? Of suicidality, of depression, of alcoholism, very important to recognize. Very big factor. And then again, loss, right? Loss of a loved one, loss of one's health. Big factor. All right. So manipulation, right? I've had lots of parents say, gosh, my child is saying they want to hurt themselves, but you know what? I don't know, Jeff. I don't know if they really are, because they're getting away from going to school. They're getting out of doing homework, chores. They're getting lots of attention from their friends. Is this a manipulation? Here's the beautiful thing, okay? Here's the good thing. If it is a manipulation, the answer is always take them to the hospital. If it's real, everything's suicidal, the answer is take them to the hospital. Why? Because if they truly are, they need that, right? One-on-one, right? That intervention. If they're not, and it's a manipulation, then it's going to be not a pleasant thing, right? Being at the hospital, it's going to be very contained. They're not going to do the things they enjoyed. And so it'll be a negative consequence, if you will, a natural consequence. But either way, take them to the hospital. All right. Okay. Any questions on suicide, suicidality before I move on to the self-harm section? Okay. All right. We'll move on. So self-harm, this is a trickier subject. It's not as black and white, right, as some other things, but really important to understand and very much on the rise. It was interesting when I started doing counseling almost 20 years ago. I worked with, clients, and again, largely children, teenagers who dealt with self-harm. But largely it was females, largely it was girls. And in the last 5 to 8 years, I've seen it increase largely with males. And then in the last 3 to 4 years, it almost feels equal. So it's been a big change in that. I think it's important to recognize that distinction. So types of self-harm. The types of self-harm are cutting, okay, using a razor blade, a knife, a needle, different objects, right, to cut in one's body. Self-poisoning, burning. Burning is a common one, whether it's using a lighter or even eraser burns. Now, kids, you've seen kids probably do this in school where they rub eraser really hard on themselves and it creates a burn. Well, kids also do this as a way to self-harm. Substance abuse, and then eating disorder. So these are all the types of self-harm. Okay. Real quick, and again, this goes back to a lot of things we talked about, but often associated with depression, anxiety, borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, and autism. So again, if you have a child dealing with one of these disorders, know that self-harm, you should be watching self-harm. So, big question is why do we why do we do self-harm? And this is individual is the person, and I've put here some of the more common ones, but gosh, there's probably a lot of other ones that that are very personal and individual. So this feeling of wanting to feel real, okay? Again, whether it's any of those things we described, but largely like the cutting, for instance, they just feel really, again, depersonalized. They just want to feel grounded. They want to feel real. They want to feel, an emotion. And so the cutting happens. Emotional release. Individuals, some will describe that by, again, self-harming, they feel this emotional lift and release. Understanding to that in many ways, this is, if you will, like any other, maladaptive coping skill or, like substances and things like that. Although they feel that in the moment, those that are honest, right, and insightful will let you know that it's short-lived and it's damaging and they feel worse later. Mindful is another one. If you think about the person who maybe is like you doing an eraser burn, right, that constant movement, that repetition, it's, people would describe it as, again, like a mindful, like a meditative exercise. Self-punishing, right? I deserve this. I'm beating myself up. I'm treating myself the way I deserve to be treated. As attention seeking. Badge of honor, right? So they kind of wear these scars, if you will, as, hey, look at me. Masochism, that's also, again, this feeling of euphoria and feeling good as they hurt themselves. And then the last one we'll talk about is playing with suicide. So some individuals, for instance, who do cut really are kind of taking those steps toward building that courage and that tolerance towards harming themselves with the idea in the future of suicide. So those are some of the common whys. I would largely, this list came from, again, just my experience and what I've seen with teenagers and adults too that I've worked with. I mean, again, this is more common with your teenage individual, but I've seen it happen in adults as well. Okay. So covered a lot. Now, the big and focus and purpose of this webinar is to help you understand, recognize, the symptoms, right, and the main factors, and so you can be there to help. Now, needless to say, if you're dealing or if your child's dealing with depression, suicidality, you've got to get help, right? You've got to get professional help. The best course of treatment, no doubt, is seeing a counselor and then seeing a doctor. The doctor may or may not prescribe, but that needs to be looked at. And again, counseling too. If you look at the statistics, a person has like an 80 to 85% chance of overcoming depression and anxiety through counseling alone. They had that same percentage if they did medication alone. But when you combine the two, you're in the high 90s. And we also have to recognize the whole purpose of medication. And I say medication specific for like major depression. And that is, it gives the person an opportunity to just feel a little bit better, even if it's 20% better. So then they can do the work they need to do. Or if it's a situational depression, they're able to kind of overcome and work through that situation until they feel better. And then a person can, taper off that medication. But it's just important that we recognize that medication's out there and it's a help and it's awesome, but that a person needs to do the work, right, to overcome, these problems and issues. So I do want to, bring this up, and that is, how do we foster emotional health, right? What can we do to help just feel better, right, overall? And whether it be someone who is maintaining, right, themselves from getting into depression, anxiety, and suicidality, or hopefully building a person so they don't fall into that problem. I think one of the number one things, of course, is sharing and processing feelings. All right, that's like the meat and potatoes, right? That's like the ABCs, the building blocks of mental health. Okay, sharing and processing feelings. Connections, right? Relationships, emotional connections, huge. Identity, all right? And again, children, they often find those in activities and things they do, right? So when they're part of a sports team, part of the band, part of a club, any interest, doesn't matter what it is, they feel a connection and this identity of who they are and a purpose. This is a big one. I mentioned earlier that kind versus nice. I won't go over that again, but be aware of that and help your children advocate for themselves, speak up for themselves. Because think about this, whether this is for you, right, or for your children, it's important to recognize that you need to take care of yourself and stand up for yourself. Because if you had a friend who wasn't standing up for you, you'd feel anxious and you wouldn't want to be with that friend. You'd maybe feel kind of depressed and down about that relationship. Well, if that person's you and you're with yourself, talk about anxiety and depression, right? You have got to advocate and stick up for yourself. Shameless, there's a big difference between being shameful and guilt, right? Sure, I get that we're going to feel guilt for making mistakes, doing things we shouldn't, right? Fine. But the problem is people then let that sink into shame, where they're constantly feeling shameful about things and horrible about things. And they're just shame will just bring you down so quick and so hard. Focused attention, right? Recognize too that individuals who struggle, okay, with focus, so ADD, ADHD, attention deficit disorder, these children who have that, especially in males, they have an 80% chance of having depression when they're older because of the struggle that creates, right? The difficulties in their functioning, in their schoolwork, and their relationships. So if you can help a child, with that, or just focusing their attention and their skills and abilities, a big way to, foster emotional health. And the last one, structure. It's important that we, with our children, give them lots of structure. They like that. They feel safe. They feel like they know where the boundaries are and where the limitations are. And that makes them feel good. I think as parents, we sometimes back off when our kids are struggling, emotionally, physically, or what have you, academically. But the truth is they feel way better when we kind of jump in and say, no, I'm taking charge. Because they know somebody is in charge. And then they'll follow and improve. Okay. All right. Well, that is my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Please, if you haven't listened to my Raising Anxiety Resilient Children one, join me next week, same day, same time. Love to have you. But before I close out, any questions? Oh, got Chantel question here. She asks, what if we cannot afford counseling? Our money issues are part of what is putting me in this state. That's that's an excellent question, right? If you're struggling, with your job, or you don't have a job, insurance is something that's an option. Yeah, counseling, absolutely, it can be expensive, right? I would say this, and that is, if you have the ability to reach out,